What if there was an island so mysterious, so terrifying, that everyone who stepped onto it was erased? Not killed, not taken, erased like they never existed? This is the story of the island the world refuses to acknowledge, and the explorers who barely escaped with something far worse than death. When the British vessel first spotted the dark silhouette on the horizon, the crew felt an unusual tension ripple across the deck. It wasn't a storm nor a threat, but something unsettling in the shape of the land itself. The island seemed almost too still, too perfectly centered within the fog that wrapped around it like a protective shell. Sailors whispered that no map had ever mentioned an island in these waters, and the captain confirmed it. This place wasn't marked anywhere, not even in classified naval archives. As they sailed closer, the island began to reveal its form. Its shoreline seemed unnaturally straight, as if carved instead of formed by nature. Strange patterns could be seen even from a distance: dark sand, jagged rocks arranged in lines, and trees that leaned in the same direction, as though bowing toward the sea. Every man on deck felt a chill, though there was no wind strong enough to cause it. It was a silence that crawled into the bones rather than the air. The sea around the island grew unnervingly calm. Not a single wave rose to greet the shore, as if the water itself was wary of touching the land. Even the birds that followed the ship refused to fly onward. They circled once above the mast and then turned away sharply, disappearing into the sky without a sound. The older sailors crossed their arms and muttered that nature never avoided a place without reason. When the ship finally anchored, air felt thick, almost heavy, as if it carried memories older than time itself. The island didn't look abandoned, it looked asleep. Even the trees stood so still that their leaves didn't rustle. One sailor said it felt like the island was watching them, waiting for them to step forward. The captain dismissed it as nerves, but he couldn't shake the feeling that every shadow hid a story no one wanted to remember. Their smaller boat touched the shore with a faint thud, and that single sound echoed far longer than it should have. The black sand beneath their feet was shockingly cold, colder than ice, yet dry as desert soil. When one sailor touched it, he jerked back as though it had pulsed beneath his palm. He insisted something felt alive within the ground, something faint but undeniable. The others laughed nervously, but none dared touch the sand again. As they moved inland, the fog parted in slow, deliberate movements, almost like curtains being drawn aside for an unwanted play. Every step deeper felt like stepping into a place untouched for centuries, a place where time itself had been forgotten. The path before them formed naturally, yet no animal tracks or footprints marked the way. It was as though countless people had walked this path, but their traces had vanished long ago. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the silence became. No insect hummed, no branches cracked beneath their feet, no wind whispered through leaves. It was a silence that pressed on their ears until they felt the urge to speak, just to break its weight. But none of them did. It felt wrong to speak here, as though sound itself didn't belong in this place. By the time they reached the first clearing, something in the air shifted. A faint electric sensation, like standing near a storm that hadn't begun yet. In the center stood the remains of what looked like an old stone foundation. No walls, no roof, just stones arranged in a perfect square, and though no one had been here for ages, the center of the foundation felt warm, as if someone had been standing there moments before they arrived. The captain wrote later, asterisk, "The island feels impossible, like it has been waiting for us." Asterisk. As the explorers stood around the strange stone foundation, an uneasiness settled over them, as if the island itself had suddenly become aware of their presence. One of the younger sailors placed his hand on one of the stones, hoping to determine whether they were natural or crafted. The moment his fingers brushed the surface, he flinched violently. The stone wasn't just warm, it pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat hidden deep inside the earth. He stepped back in silent panic, unable to explain what he felt. The captain ordered everyone to remain calm, but his voice trembled almost imperceptibly. He had seen ruins before, ancient settlements, abandoned temples, forgotten villages, but never anything that felt alive. The stones were too symmetrical, precise, as if shaped by hands that understood something beyond human architecture. Even nature around it seemed to bend subtly toward the structure, as though the forest itself was paying silent respect. The deeper they examined the foundation, the more wrong everything felt. One sailor noticed that no matter where he stood, he felt a cold presence behind him. Yet every time he turned around, there was nothing. Another sailor swore he heard footsteps circling the clearing, soft and unhurried, although the ground was too soft to echo anything. The captain denied it, but the look in his eyes showed he heard them too. The air thickened again, denser than before, making it difficult to breathe normally. The men felt their lungs tightening, not from fear, but from something invisible weighing down on them. A faint hum began to vibrate through the ground, so low it was almost imperceptible, but strong enough to make their boots tremble slightly. It wasn't mechanical, nor natural. It felt like something ancient stirring beneath the surface. One of the sailors, a man known for his strong nerves, knelt to inspect the soil between the stones. As he brushed away the dust, his hand froze. The ground wasn't dirt. It was something dark and glassy, like obsidian melted into the earth. But the terrifying part was the reflections. As he leaned closer, he saw shapes moving within them. Black surface shadows that didn't match any of their positions. Shadows that seemed to watch him. Another sailor called out suddenly, pointing at the trees surrounding them. The trunks were marked with faint spiraling symbols glowing very subtly, almost invisible unless someone stared for too long. They weren't carved. They seemed to be part of the tree's natural growth. The vines wrapped around them in patterns too deliberate to be random, like nature itself had been shaped by some forgotten intelligence. The forest felt ancient, as if it carried memories that refused to die. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the clearing, so sharp and sudden that every man felt it like a blade across the skin. Yet the leaves didn't move, the branches didn't sway. Only the cold traveled through them, chilling their bones as if reminding them they were intruders in a place that rejected outsiders. Some men instinctively stepped closer to each other, their breaths visible. Though the day wasn't cold enough for that, the captain tried to take a step toward the other end of the foundation, but the moment he did, the hum beneath the ground intensified. The soil vibrated harder, and for a heartbeat, the entire clearing felt like it shifted, like the island exhaled. A low groan traveled through the trees, not from an animal or the wind, but from the island itself, as though it protested their movement. The sailors exchanged frightened looks. None of them dared to voice what they were thinking. That the island wasn't abandoned. It was waiting, listening, measuring them, and every second they stood there, the island felt less like land and more like a presence, something aware, ancient, and uninterested in mercy. The last sailor to speak was the quietest one, a man who rarely shared his fears. He whispered that they needed to leave the clearing, not because of what they saw, but because of what they felt. He said the island didn't want them there, and something unseen was surrounding them, closing in little by little. When he said this, every man felt it too. The invisible pressure, the slow tightening of the air, the sense that something just beyond the trees was watching, waiting for them to take one more step. When the explorers left the clearing and resumed walking, the forest grew even denser, as if the island wanted to swallow them whole. The path ahead twisted unnaturally, curving in ways that didn't match the map they had drawn only hours before. The trees looked the same, yet somehow rearranged themselves, creating an unsettling feeling that the forest was subtly shifting while they weren't looking. No matter how far they walked, the sound of the waves behind them faded until it felt like the ocean itself had disappeared. The silence became unbearable. Not a single bird chirped, not a leaf rustled, and not even insects buzzed around them. It was the type of silence that felt intentional, like every creature had vanished or was hiding from something the explorers had yet to see. The absence of nature's noise made every breath sound too loud, too intrusive, as if the forest would punish them for disturbing its stillness. One of the sailors tried to mark a tree to avoid getting lost, carving a small line with his knife, but when he turned around moments later, the marking was gone, the bark perfectly smooth as if it had never been touched. He tried again, scratching another mark deeper this time, but the same thing happened. This time, he watched the mark disappear slowly, the wood knitting itself back together like living skin. He staggered backward in fear, convinced the island was erasing their presence in real time. The deeper they walked, the more the landscape began to play tricks on their minds. Trees seemed to lean toward them, casting long, thin shadows that stretched impossibly far across the ground. The sunlight dimmed, not because the day was ending, but because the canopy above thickened unnaturally fast. What had been a calm afternoon began to feel like the edge of nightfall, even though the sun should still have been high. One sailor dropped his compass in panic when its needle began spinning wildly. The compass wasn't broken. Something around them was disrupting it. The needle rotated faster and faster until it snapped off inside the glass. The sailor froze, unable to understand how something so solid could break under an invisible force. The other men watched in horrified silence, realizing that nothing on this island followed the rules of the world they knew. A sudden echo of footsteps emerged behind them, slow and deliberate. The explorers spun around immediately, expecting an animal or another person, but the path was empty. The footsteps stopped the moment they looked, only to start again when they faced forward. The sound got closer, soft, but unmistakably human. It felt like someone was walking just out of sight, following them without hurry, without fear, without intention to hide. The forest grew colder with every step, but the cold wasn't natural. It felt targeted, like a presence pressing gently against their backs. One of the men whispered that it felt like the island was breathing down their necks. Every time the group slowed down, the footsteps behind them stopped. Every time they sped up, footsteps matched their pace. It was as if the unseen follower wasn't chasing them. It was hurting them somewhere. As panic began to rise, the sailor at the back of the group shouted when he felt something brush past his arm. He spun around but saw nothing, only trees standing in complete stillness. Yet he swore he felt fingers, cold and slender, graze his skin. The captain tried to calm him, but even he looked shaken. The idea that something invisible was close enough to touch them made the air feel heavier, charged with a fear none of them dared to voice. When they attempted to turn back toward the beach, the path behind them seemed different. The trees were arranged strangely, twisting at odd angles, forming shapes that resembled faces if stared at too long. The forest no longer looked like a place they could escape from. It felt like a maze designed not to trap them physically, but to break their sense of direction, their confidence, and their sanity. The final moment came when the sailor in front stopped abruptly and pointed ahead with trembling hands. The path they had been following simply ended. Not in rocks, not in water, but in empty nothingness. The trees formed a perfect circle around a clearing that hadn't been there moments earlier. At the center was a single stone pillar, tall and ancient, with fresh markings that seemed to glow faintly. Markings were not old, they were new, freshly carved, as if something had prepared that place just before they arrived. The men stared in terrified silence, realizing the island was not just watching them, it was guiding them to something none of them were ready to face. When the explorers stepped into the strange clearing, an unnatural stillness fell over them. The air felt heavier there, almost sticky, like it was thick with memories they couldn't see. The stone pillar in the center seemed harmless from afar, but the closer they walked, the more they noticed details that made their heart pound. The surface of the stone wasn't smooth. It was covered in small handprints, all pressed deeply into the rock, as if made by dozens of people trying to hold onto something before disappearing. One of the sailors reached out cautiously to touch the pillar, but before his hand could make contact, a wave of cold radiated from it. The cold wasn't normal, it shot through the air like a warning, enough to make the man snatch back his hand. The others felt it too, a sudden drop in temperature that didn't belong in a tropical forest. It was the kind of cold that felt alive, the kind that made you feel watched even in an empty clearing. As they circled the pillar, they saw symbols carved into the stone. They didn't resemble any known language, no curves, no familiar alphabets. Instead, they were jagged, sharp, and formed in chaotic patterns, almost like scratches made by desperate hands. The markings pulsed faintly, glowing as if reacting to the presence of the explorers. Each pulse sent a ripple through the clearing, causing the trees around them to sway, even though there was no wind. One of the crew members pointed out that the ground around the pillar was strangely disturbed. The soil was uneven and looked freshly moved, like someone had dug it up recently. But there were no tools, no footprints, and no signs of human work. It was as if the earth itself had shifted on its own. The thought of that possibility made the men uneasy, forcing them to take several steps back instinctively. Moments later, a sudden echo broke the silence, a distant sound like metal scraping across rock. All of them froze instantly. The noise wasn't coming from the forest, it was coming from beneath the ground. The scraping grew louder, repeating in long, slow strokes, as if something deep below the surface was dragging itself toward the clearing. The men exchanged terrified glances, unsure whether to run or stay still. Without warning, the stone pillar began to vibrate softly. At first, the vibrations were gentle, almost like a heartbeat, but soon they grew stronger, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The glowing markings brightened, casting an eerie light across the clearing. The trees around them bent forward slightly, as if bowing toward the pillar, and the air filled with a low hum that made their bones tremble. One sailor whispered that they should leave immediately, but his voice sounded small, drowned out by the hum. Another sailor tried to step back toward the forest, but the moment his foot touched the grass near the edge, the trees seemed to close in, their branches weaving together like gates sealing shut. The path they came from was no longer visible. It was as if the island had decided they weren't allowed to leave yet. The hum grew deeper, vibrating in their chests, making it hard to breathe. One of the explorers covered his ears, but the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside their heads. The pillar glowed so brightly now that the men could see the outlines of those old handprints stretching across the stone, and strangely they looked newer, clearer, as if they were appearing one by one, being carved right in front of them. A faint whisper floated through the clearing, but it wasn't spoken by anyone in the group. It was a voice that didn't sound human, soft, layered, almost echoing itself. The sailor looked around frantically, but there was no source for the sound. The whisper wasn't telling them anything coherent, but it carried emotion, desperation, pleading, warning. It felt like someone long gone was trying to tell them to turn back, but there was nowhere left to go. The ground beneath the pillar cracked suddenly, releasing a thin stream of cold mist that spiraled upward like a ghostly hand. The men backed away as far as they could, terrified that something was emerging from below. The pillar's glow flickered violently, like a flame struggling against a storm, and in that moment, the explorers realized something terrifying. The island wasn't just erasing its visitors, it was collecting them. The moment they uncovered the ancient carvings on the pillar, the atmosphere around them shifted. The air turned colder, but not in a natural way, more like the cold that comes from something unseen passing too close. The carvings glowed faintly beneath the explorer's touch, lines of pale silver light tracing themselves across the stone as though waking from centuries of sleep. The men stared in awe and confusion, trying to understand what they had awakened. The glow spread outward from the pillar and seeped into the ground, moving like veins beneath the soil. It traveled in twisting patterns, connecting to the roots of the trees surrounding the clearing. One root after another lit up with the same eerie silver light, and slowly the forest floor began to illuminate. The explorers took a cautious step back, realizing the island wasn't just reacting. It was remembering. And whatever memory it held was far from peaceful. As the light grew stronger, images began to form on the surface of the pillar. At first they appeared blurry and indistinct, like fog forming shapes. Then they sharpened into scenes. Crowds of people gathered around the same clearing centuries ago, their faces brimming with desperation. The explorers watched as these ancient figures prayed, argued, and finally fled in panic from something approaching from the sea. But the carvings didn't show what that threat was. They only showed the terror it brought. One explorer reached out to touch the glowing stone again, but the moment his fingers made contact, the images shifted violently. Instead of crowds, they now showed the island trembling under massive storms, waves crashing against its shores, trees being ripped from the ground, lightning splitting the sky. But the strangest part was that the people carved into the stone didn't look surprised by the destruction. They looked resigned, as though they expected the island to be swallowed again and again. A deep rumble echoed beneath the ground, startling the men. The pillar vibrated, and small fragments of dust cascaded down its sides. The carvings shifted once more, this time showing the island in total darkness. Figures wandered through the shadows, transparent, fragile, almost ghosts. Like they weren't attacking anything, they were searching, reaching out as though desperately trying to remember who they once were. The explorers exchanged horrified glances. These figures didn't look alive, but they didn't look gone either. The ground beneath the men pulsed again, more forcefully. It felt as though the island was breathing beneath them. The soil rose and fell in slow, rhythmic waves, pushing up old fragments of pottery, shattered tools, and broken pieces of structures long forgotten. The men realized they weren't standing on a simple clearing. They were standing on the remains of an entire civilization buried under centuries of silence, and the island was forcing those memories to the surface. The glowing veins along the forest floor brightened until they formed a circular pattern. Around the group, it was clear now that the island wasn't showing random scenes. It was showing a story, its own story. A story of people who came here with hope, settled, built lives, and vanished without a trace. The explorers felt a sharp chill of dread as they understood that the island didn't erase them instantly. It kept them holding onto their memories as if refusing to let them move on. Wind crept through the trees even though the air had been still moments before, but the wind didn't rustle the leaves, it whispered through them. The explorers could swear they heard faint voices riding on the breeze, echoing fragments of pleas, warnings, and cries for help. It was as if the island had absorbed the voices of the vanished people and now released them in small, painful bursts, unable to contain the weight of its own history. One of the men stepped closer to the pillar again, drawn by the glowing light despite his fear. When he reached out, the carvings revealed one final image. A group of explorers standing in the exact same spot, surrounded by the same glowing roots, the same whispered warnings. But in the image, those explorers slowly faded away, turning in shadows that blended with the forest. The man snatched his hand back in horror, realizing the island was not just showing the past, it was showing what might happen to them. The glow from the pillow flickered, dimmed, and then steadied again as though it was waiting for the explorers to understand the truth the island had held for centuries. The past civilization had vanished, leaving behind only echoes, trapped memories, and voices woven into the roots of the forest. And now, with every passing second, the island seemed to be drawing the new visitors deeper into its story, as if history was ready to repeat itself. The storm began without warning. The sky above the island darkened so quickly that the explorers barely had time to look up. One moment, the clearing was dim but visible. The next, Everything was swallowed by rolling clouds the color of ash. The air thickened, heavy with pressure, as if the sky itself was lowering toward the ground. Lightning cracked somewhere far off, but the sound didn't follow. Instead, the island soaked up the thunder, leaving only an empty, echoing silence. Rain started falling in thin, icy strands, each drop hitting the ground with an unnatural hiss. The men shivered, not because of the cold, but because the rain didn't feel like normal water. It felt almost sharp, stinging their skin like tiny needles. They covered their heads, trying to shield themselves, but the rain seemed to find its way through every gap, forcing them to squint and blink rapidly as their vision blurred. The forests surrounding the clearing reacted strangely to the storm. The trees bent unnaturally low, as if being pushed by a wind that the explorers couldn't feel. Leaves fell upward instead of downward, spiraling into the black sky. Like sparks from a fire, the branches shook violently, yet the air around the men remained eerily still. It was as if nature had split into two separate worlds, one visible, one hidden, but both surrounding them at once. A loud crack tore through the island, more violent than thunder. The ground beneath them shook, and one of the explorers lost his balance, falling to his knees. The earth trembled again, this time more forcefully, sending ripples through the dirt like waves on water. The floor of the forest seemed alive, breathing, shifting, reacting to their presence. The pillar in the center flickered intensely, its light fighting against the darkness gathering around it. As the storm grew more violent, the whispering began again, but stronger this time, louder, clearer. Voices layered over one another like an entire crowd whispering in unison. They weren't speaking words the men could understand, but the emotion inside those whispers was unmistakable. Fear, urgency, and something far deeper, regret. Every whisper felt like it was brushing against their ears, pressing into their minds, urging them to run, even though escape was impossible. The lightning returned, not striking from above, but shooting upward from the ground, crackling through the mist like glowing veins. Each bolt illuminated the trees in sharp, ghostly flashes, revealing shapes and shadows that shouldn't have been there, silhouettes that looked almost human, standing between the trees, watching silently. But the moment the light faded, the figures vanished, leaving only the echo of their presence behind. One of the explorers shouted a prayer, trying to gather his courage, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. He tried again, louder, but even he couldn't hear himself. It was as if the island didn't want their voices to exist. It took their words and buried them instantly in the thick, suffocating air. The men stood closer together, forming a tight circle, their hearts pounding wildly, each of them wondering whether this was a storm or a warning. The rain intensified, falling so hard that it turned the ground into dark mud within seconds. The mud wasn't normal either. It moved in slow, unnatural ripples like something underneath was pushing it from below. One of the sailors stumbled backward as the mud expanded beneath his feet, stretching like it wanted to swallow him. He jumped away just in time, his boots splashing the shifting earth. An enormous gust of wind finally slammed into them, bending the trees all the way to the ground. The men braced themselves, holding onto each other to avoid being thrown off their feet. The wind roared like a beast, howling through the clearing with a sound so powerful it felt alive. The pillar's light burst upward, forming a streak through the sky, and for a moment the storm froze, as if staring back at the explorers. Then something changed. The storm didn't calm, it shifted. The clouds above spiraled into a single point directly over the clearing, forming a massive, swirling vortex. It pulsed like a heartbeat, drawing the air upward, pulling leaves, dust, and even small branches into its spinning center. It was clear now that the storm wasn't natural, it wasn't weather, it was the island itself reacting, transforming, and preparing for something far worse. The ground stopped shaking, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying than the storm. It was a silence so complete that the explorers could hear their own breathing echo inside their heads. The air felt heavy, dense, as if Every sound had been pulled out of the world. Even the forest seemed frozen. The trees no longer moved. The leaves hung unnaturally still, suspended in midair as though the entire island was holding its breath. One of the men took a cautious step forward, and the moment his boot touched the ground, the pillar in the center flared with a sudden, blinding light. He flinched and shielded his face. But when he lowered his hand, the clearing had changed again. Strange markings began appearing on the earth, thin lines, glowing faintly like trails of fire. They spread outward in circular patterns, twisting into symbols none of them recognized. The men exchanged fearful glances. The island wasn't just reacting, it was speaking. The glowing lines began to pulse, slow at first, then faster, like the heartbeat of something deep beneath the ground. With every pulse, the forest grew dimmer. Shadows stretched across the clearing, long and thin, creeping toward the men as though drawn to their fear. The explorers backed away from them instinctively, but the shadows moved with purpose, almost as if they had minds of their own. The whispers returned, but they were no longer scattered or faint. This time the voices were deep and layered, carrying emotion so heavy the men felt it in their bones. It wasn't anger, it wasn't aggression, it was sorrow, deep ancient sorrow, the kind that comes from memories too painful to hold. The voices drifted around the group like fog, circling them slowly, almost mournfully, as if recounting a tragedy only the island remembered. One explorer felt a sudden wave of dizziness, like something was pressing against his thoughts. He grabbed his head, trying to fight the sensation, but images flashed before his eyes, brief, chaotic glimpses of people who had stood in the same clearing centuries earlier. He saw faces twisted in fear, saw hands reaching upward as if begging for mercy, saw crowds running through the forest as storms tore their world apart. The visions vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving him trembling and pale. Another man fell to his knees, not from weakness, but from an overwhelming weight in his chest. It felt as if the sadness in the voices was sinking into him, making it hard to breathe. The island wasn't harming them physically, but it was showing them its grief, its loneliness, its history of loss, and the deeper the voices grew, the more he felt like the island wasn't trying to keep them out. It was trying to warn them to leave before they became part of its story. The symbols on ground glowed brighter, illuminating the clearing in a dull red haze. The forest around them looked different now, older, twisted, scarred. The men realized with a shudder that the island had shown them a part of its past, but not all of it. They sensed there was something else, something hidden deeper within the island, something the forest was afraid of. Even the whispers seemed to tremble as they continued circling the clearing. A sudden gust of warm air brushed against their backs, and the men spun around quickly. The shadows that had crept toward them were now standing still, as if waiting for something. The explorers could feel their presence, silent, watching, almost human. One explorer stepped back, bumping into another, his voice shaking as he whispered for them to stay. Together, the clearing felt smaller now, tighter, like the island was pulling the world inward. The pillar flickered again, dimming for a moment before bursting into a narrow beam of light that shot straight upward. The beam pierced the sky, splitting the clouds above like a blade, but instead of spreading outward, the light bent sharply, curving back down and pointing toward the forest behind them. It was directing them, showing them something or someone. The men stared at the glowing path, unsure whether to follow it or flee from it. Something moved in the trees beyond the beam's end. Not fast, not violent, slow, deliberate. A silhouette stepped forward, blurry but unmistakably human-shaped. The men instinctively backed away, fear tightening their chests, but the figure didn't move. Closer, it simply stood there, half hidden in the shadows, as though trapped between two worlds. And with each second that passed, the explorers felt more certain that this figure wasn't alive, but wasn't gone either. The moment they turned toward the figure standing in the trees, the forest around them seemed to shift its shape. The trunks elongated, the shadows deepened, and the air thickened. so much that every breath felt like inhaling fog. The figure did not move. It stood unnervingly still, half covered by the darkness, as if the shadows themselves were holding it in place. Explorers felt an instinctive fear rise in their chests, the kind of fear that comes not from danger, but from something ancient and unknown. The beam of light from the pillar remained fixed on figure, illuminating it in fragments. For a split second, one explorer thought he saw a face pale, drained, eyes empty but searching. But when he blinked, the face became nothing more than a silhouette again. The figure looked as if it had been caught between worlds, unable to step forward or disappear. It felt familiar, but not in a comforting way, more like a memory they had never lived. The figure lifted its head slightly, and the forest responded instantly. The trees groaned as though pushed by an invisible force. Leaves spiraled upward. The ground trembled with a slow, dragging vibration that felt like footsteps made from the earth itself. The explorers could feel the island watching them, breathing around them, reacting not to their actions but to the presence of silent figure now illuminated before them. A sudden gust of wind brushed past them, but the leaves didn't move in its direction. Instead, they twisted toward the figure, pulled by an invisible current. It was as if the island's entire atmosphere was being drawn toward this single point, gathering around the shadow like a shroud. One of the explorers whispered a prayer under his breath, not from fear of the figure, but from the overwhelming sense that something profound, something tragic was unfolding before them. The figure finally moved, but not in a human way. It didn't take a step. It simply shifted like a reflection in water disturbed by a ripple. Its outline wavered, briefly splitting into two before merging back together. The explorers' hearts pounded. They could feel a strange pressure behind their eyes, as if the island was pushing images into their minds, urging them to understand what the figure truly was. But the harder they tried to focus, the more the figure blurred. The beam of light flickered again, and this time fragments of scenes appeared inside it, like flashes of history trapped inside a narrow column of illumination. The explorers saw glimpses of people running through the forest, carrying children, holding hands, searching for safety. And among those fleeting images, they saw the same silhouette standing in the exact same place. Realization hit them. This figure had not appeared recently. It had been there for centuries. The ground beneath the figure shifted, pushing up old stones and pieces of worn pottery. The explorer recognized the patterns carved on them. They were the same symbols the pillar had shown earlier. It was as if the earth itself was trying to reveal the truth buried beneath the island. The figure was connected to the vanished civilization. Maybe it was a warning, maybe it was a survivor, or maybe it was what remained when the island erased someone from the world. The figure raised one hand slowly, not to threaten, but almost as though it was reaching out to them. The explorers took an involuntary step back, yet they couldn't look away. The hand wasn't fully solid. It flickered faintly, shimmering like smoke caught in a beam of sunlight. The explorers felt a wave of emotion hitting them, not from the figure but from the island itself. A mixture of longing, sorrow, and something that felt eerily like recognition. The trees around the clearing bent even lower, their branches arching inward as though forming a protective dome. The shadows stretched along the ground toward the figure, then stopped abruptly, as if afraid to touch it. The explorers realized that the island wasn't reacting to them. It was reacting to the figure. They were simply caught in the middle of a story far older than their journey. The weight of that truth pressed on them until their knees nearly buckled. Then, without warning, the figure's outline collapsed inward, folding into itself like smoke, being swallowed by the dark. It didn't run. It didn't fall. It simply dissolved, leaving behind nothing but a faint shimmer in the air. The forest exhaled, the trees straightened, and the beam from the pillar dimmed, but the explorers felt nothing like relief. What frightened them most wasn't that the figure had disappeared. It was the cold, empty certainty that it wasn't gone. It had simply moved somewhere else within the island. The explorers moved slowly through the forest, their steps unsteady as the island's silence wrapped around them. It wasn't just quiet, it was unnatural, as if the island had exhaled and forgotten how to breathe again. Every leaf, every branch, every shadow felt frozen, watching them with an eerie stillness. The absence of sound pressed against their ears, until their own heartbeat felt deafening. With each step, the weight of the island's revelation followed them like a cold hand gripping their shoulders. As they approached the shoreline, the waves behaved strangely. They didn't crash or ripple. Instead, they rolled inward in slow, silent movements that felt choreographed, as though the ocean itself was afraid to disturb whatever had awakened. Beneath the island, the water reflected the sky perfectly, not a single distortion, as if it were a sheet of polished glass. One of the explorers reached toward it, but the moment his finger touched the surface, the reflection rippled violently, distorting into shapes that didn't belong to any human form. A sudden gust of wind blew past them, carrying with it faint whispers, soft, trembling, impossible to understand. The voices sounded distant, like memories of people who had once stood on this same shore. The explorers froze, trying to listen, but the whispers dissolved the moment they focused on them. Instead, the voices returned only when they turned away, slipping into their minds like fading echoes. The island was speaking again, but not with images or symbols. It was using voices of those who came before. The sand beneath their feet began to shift, forming shallow grooves that stretched toward the water. The grooves became lines, and the lines twisted into symbols, similar to those they had seen glowing in the clearing. But these marks lacked the gentle light. They looked carved, forced, as if created in desperation. The explorers knelt, tracing the patterns. With trembling fingers, they felt something buried beneath the sand, not an object but an emotion, fear, heavy and ancient, trapped in the earth like a warning left too late. The sky darkened, abruptly, clouds forming in unnatural spirals above the island. They rotated in tight circles, slow but deliberate, as though drawn toward a center point only the island could see. A dim light glowed from within the clouds, pulsating like a heartbeat, echoing the same rhythm the ground once produced. The explorers felt the vibration in their chest, syncing with their pulse until they weren't sure which beat belonged to them and which belonged to the sky. A deep rumble traveled through the sand, shaking the beach with a steady, rising intensity. The shoreline cracked in jagged lines that spread outward like lightning. Water seeped through the cracks, but instead of flowing naturally, it climbed upward in thin spirals, rising like strands of liquid thread. The explorers could only stare in disbelief as the water twisted itself into shapes resembling hands, faces, and shifting silhouettes that disappeared as quickly as they formed. The whispers grew louder, no longer soft. Distant, they rushed toward the explorers like a wave of voices pleading, warning, repeating fragmented words that overlapped until they were impossible to separate. The explorers covered their ears, but the voices didn't stop. They spoke inside their minds, vibrating through their thoughts. These weren't ghosts. They weren't hallucinations. These were memories of people the island had erased, trapped forever between reality and silence. A cold panic spread through the group as the wooden boats they had brought drifted toward the shore on their own. The ropes they used to tie them were still intact, meaning the boats hadn't broken free. They had been pulled hard. The sand around the ropes showed deep grooves, as if something had dragged the boats closer to the explorers, inviting them or pushing them to leave before it was too late. But the island had shown too much to let them go freely. As they backed away, the ground trembled again, but this time it carried a feeling they recognized instantly: finality. Like the island was closing a chapter, sealing away its exposed memories. The symbols in the sand shook, then folded in on themselves, vanishing beneath the shifting surface. The whispers faded into silence, leaving only the echo of fear lingering in the air. Even the spiraling clouds above began to dissolve, their heart beat like pulse, slowing until it stopped completely. The explorers stood frozen, unable to move, unsure whether they had been warned or chosen. The island no longer felt silent. It felt expectant, waiting, watching, deciding. As the last wave rolled across the beach with unnatural smoothness, they realized the truth. Once the island revealed its past, no visitor had ever truly walked away unchanged. The moment the explorers stepped onto the boat, the air around them shifted. It felt heavier, denser, as if the island's breath was pressing against their backs, unwilling to let them go. For a heartbeat, the water remained unnaturally calm. Then, without warning, the boat lurched forward, pushed by a current they couldn't see. The island stayed silent, but the silence carried a strange tension, almost like a final stare from something ancient and sentient. As the boat drifted away, one of the explorers looked back and felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. The shoreline was changing. The trees near the edge bent inward unnaturally, their branches twisting as if they were reaching out. The sand shifted in long waves, erasing their footprints one by one. It was as though the island was wiping away the last evidence of their presence, sealing the memory of them before they had even left its sight. The sky darkened again, not with clouds, but with something thicker, like a curtain being drawn by invisible hands. The island's outline blurred behind a wall of mist that rose from nowhere. It spread with unnatural precision, wrapping around the entire landmass in seconds. The island didn't disappear behind fog. It swallowed itself, hiding its shape until it became nothing more than a faint, pulsing shadow behind the gray. A deep hum vibrated through the ocean, so low that it rattled the wooden boards beneath their feet. The explorers exchanged terrified glances. They had felt this vibration before, when the ground beneath the island pulsed like a heartbeat, but this was stronger, deeper, and far more deliberate. The ocean was trembling as if reacting to something that had awakened beneath the island's surface. The mist expanded outward, creeping toward the boat. It moved in slow, steady waves like a living thing determined to drag them back into the island's hidden grip. The explorers scrambled to paddle, but every stroke felt weaker than the last. The ocean didn't fight them, but it didn't help either. It simply held them in place, suspended between escape and return, while the mist grew thicker and closer, swallowing the horizon. A soft whisper brushed against their ears, though none of them were close enough to speak to each other. It wasn't the chaotic chorus they had heard on shore. It was a single voice, calm and cold, like a memory replaying itself. It repeated the same phrase in a language they didn't recognize, yet the meaning settled heavily in their minds. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a plea. It was a promise, one the island had given to every visitor before them. The boat suddenly rocked as if something massive had passed beneath it. Water splashed upward, but the surface remained perfectly smooth a moment later, erasing any sign of disturbance. The explorers held onto the sides, searching the water for movement, but there was nothing, not even a ripple. The ocean was too silent, too perfect, as if it were hiding whatever moved beneath it with unnatural precision. A burst of wind hit them from behind, so forceful it nearly tipped the boat forward. It pushed them away from the island with a speed they couldn't explain. The mist stopped advancing, the vibrations faded, the whispers went silent. It felt like the island had finally made its decision and released them. But the release wasn't comforting. It felt like being thrown out, dismissed, or marked in a way they couldn't yet understand. As the island faded completely behind the rising wall of mist, a final sound echoed across the water. It wasn't a voice this time. It was a distant, hollow rumble like a door being shut deep underground. The explorers froze, knowing instinctively that this wasn't a closing of something physical. It was the island sealing away its secrets again, hiding everything it had revealed, and travelers who witnessed too much were never meant to return. When they finally reached open water, the world around them felt strangely different. The air felt colder, the sky duller, and their own thoughts seemed heavier. They didn't speak, not because they were afraid of the story, but because a part of them felt like the island wasn't truly behind them. Something lingered, an invisible mark placed upon them by a land that erased every visitor it chose. And even as the boat drifted into safety, each explorer knew the truth. They might have escaped the island, but they had not escaped what it had taken from them. Some stories end when the characters escape, but this story never truly ends, because the explorers didn't bring the island's secrets back with them. The island sent something after them, and to this day, none of them can close their eyes without hearing that same whisper calling them back. The island erases those who visit, yet the memory of it refuses to be erased.